Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the New Mexico territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1872. The New Mexico territory was vast, harsh, and poorly connected by law or faith. At the edges of settlement, the line between a homestead and a frontier outpost was thin, and men who kept to themselves were often left to their privacy. It was in such a setting that one farmer, later remembered only as the Homesteader, raised his livestock behind crude wooden pens not far from a dusty crossroads. His house, a two-story stone dwelling with a pitched roof and smoke curling from its chimney, looked respectable at first glance. Yet county records show that those who passed through remembered an atmosphere not of warmth, but of wariness. At this time, tensions in New Mexico were rising between competing factions of settlers and traders. Just a few years later, the Lincoln County War would erupt, setting neighbor against neighbor in disputes over land and cattle. It is against this backdrop of suspicion, greed, and lawlessness that the story of the Homesteader took root. Travelers described him as courteous but curt, often standing at his gate in worn boots, vest, and broad-brimmed hat. He was never seen without a watchful dog by his side and the low grunting of hogs behind the fence. While some neighbors praised his discipline, others noted a strangeness in his eyes, a fixed gaze, as though he were always measuring those before him. One surviving affidavit from a wagoner named Elias Horn recalled stopping by the homestead for water. He described the man's pigs as unusually restless, their pen dug deep into the earth, churned and dark. Elias noted, "The animals were fat as sin, though no corn crib nor feed was in sight. The man said nothing of their diet, and I was glad to leave before dusk." Not long after, drifters and peddlers moving along the old territorial road began to vanish. Some were dismissed as victims of bandits, or as men who abandoned their lives to try fortune elsewhere. But rumors whispered of last sightings near the stone house, of hoofprints leading one way but not returning, and of the low, almost human cries said to be heard from the pig pens at night. Newspaper clippings from the Santa Fe Gazette in 1873 briefly mentioned the disappearances, but gave no names, only noting a troubling number of absences reported near the southern frontier. In such isolated corners, the law was slow to act. A constable might pass once a season, if at all. In the silence between, stories festered. It is within these gaps of record and rumor that our case survives. Fragments of testimony, stray ledger notes, and oral accounts pieced together decades later by historians paint a chilling picture. A solitary farmer who may have found in his hogs not only sustenance, but a means of disposal. A clerk named William R. Pruitt signed the file in early 1870, noting the purchase of 60 acres by a man of uncertain origin, giving only the name E.S. Carver. Some suggested this was an alias, for no census entries or earlier claims matched the name. Whatever his beginnings, Carver quickly became known simply as the Homesteader, and his property soon developed a reputation not for prosperity, but for silence. Neighbors reported that few visitors lingered. A preacher, Reverend Amos Gill, later testified that Carver attended services only once, sitting in the back pew without hymn or prayer. The Reverend recalled, "His look was not hostile, but as though the Lord's house was foreign to him, like a man long abroad." After that Sunday, Carver was not seen in church again. By 1871, a trickle of missing persons notices began circulating in local broadsheets. A Mexican trader hauling cloth, a pair of young German immigrants bound for Colorado, and a drifter known only as Sam with the Fiddle. None were found, nor were their animals or wagons recovered. County records contain scattered reports of searches, but these were half-hearted at best. The distances were vast, the law thin, and the trail cold before it could be followed. The few who dared speak openly began whispering of the hogs. Pigs are omnivorous by nature, capable of devouring almost anything given time. Farmers knew this well, but few relied on them as heavily as Carver. A midwife named Clara Holt, who lived 3 miles away, recalled in a letter, "I never saw him purchase grain nor slop, yet those hogs grew monstrous fat. Their eyes shone wicked, and their pens stank worse than any sty I ever attended." Still, nothing tied these suspicions to hard evidence. The homesteader remained polite if distant when approached. He offered water to travelers, and his property, though rough, bore no obvious signs of crime. Without bodies or confessions, rumor alone could not rouse the county marshal. Meanwhile, the broader territory simmered. The conflicts that would culminate in the Lincoln County War were already brewing. Land monopolies, cattle theft, and armed factions making their claims. Against such large disturbances, the fate of a handful of missing drifters drew little official concern. Yet in taverns and camps, the tale of the stone house with its restless hogs gained traction. One soldier passing through is said to have remarked in his journal, "The man is courteous, but the yard carries a heaviness. One feels watched, even when standing alone. The hogs make a terrible racket as dusk falls, and their pen is dug far deeper than needful." In such fragments, a picture emerges. A frontier farm that appeared ordinary, yet carried within it an aura so strong that even the practical men of the West, soldiers, traders, and preachers, felt unease. The first true attempt at inquiry came in the autumn of 1872 when a ranch hand named Thomas Beale failed to arrive at his employer's spread after leaving Mesilla. Beale had been paid in coin for cattle work and was last seen riding a bay mare northward along the territorial road. Witnesses placed him passing near Carver's property at dusk. Neither Beale nor his horse were ever seen again. His employer, a seasoned rancher named Isaac Drum, pressed the county marshal to investigate. Marshal Henry Lowe, reluctant but pressed by repeated complaints, agreed to ride out. His journal, preserved in fragments, records the visit. "The man Carver received me civilly, offering water and bread. His house appeared in order, though Spartan, pigs numerous, large, and near frantic in their pen. No trace of Beale nor of his horse was discovered. I asked direct, and Carver replied he had seen no rider, though he admitted the road passed close." Lowe, like many officers in the territory, had limited authority and fewer resources. Without evidence, he could not detain Carver. He returned empty-handed, filing only a short note in the courthouse. Yet Drum remained convinced foul play was at hand. He spread word in taverns that Beale had been fed to the hogs. The phrase stuck. By winter, the homesteader was whispered of in campfires as the man with the pigs. Still, no official charge followed. Isolated farmers disappeared often in those years, claimed by outlaws, fever, or storms. To pin all vanishings on one taciturn man seemed rash, yet the pattern continued. A second report emerged that same winter, when a pair of brothers traveling westward vanished without trace. Their wagon was later found abandoned, its canvas torn some 20 miles downriver. A ferryman swore he had seen them earlier that week near the Carver homestead, looking weary, leading their oxen. Again, no trace after. It was around this time that a few daring neighbors began noting strange sights. A young schoolteacher, Miss Lydia Crane, wrote in a letter to her cousin, "The night of Christmas Eve, passing with my uncle, we spied firelight from Carver's yard. The pigs squealed as though in torment, and we saw him shoveling into their pen. I know not what he carried, but the air was foul, and the noise most unnatural." Her testimony, like others, was kept private at first. People feared the man, though he had never raised a hand against them. His stillness, his self-sufficiency, and the unsettling fatness of his hogs spoke louder than open violence. Meanwhile, distant political troubles deepened. Rival factions in Lincoln County drew weapons over cattle contracts, laying the groundwork for open conflict within a few years. Historians later suggested that amid such broader unrest, local lawmen were unwilling to pursue a case built only on unease and rumor. The Lincoln County War would later stain the whole region with blood, and in that context, one farmer's hog pen was considered trivial. Yet by early 1873, rumors reached beyond the county line. Traders in Santa Fe carried the tale, embroidered with every retelling, a man whose hogs grew fat on human flesh. Whether true or not, the legend was already beginning to outpace the thin records. The first hint of physical evidence came not from officials, but from the land itself. In the spring thaw of 1873, heavy rains loosened the soil around Carver's pens. A neighbor, Ezra Long, passing by on muleback, later testified in a signed statement that he noticed dark stains rising through the mud near the lowest corner of the fence. He described an odor sharp as iron, sour as rot, and saw the hogs rooting at the softened earth with frenzied squeals. Ezra reported this to the local justice of the peace, one Mr. Harlan Royce. Royce wrote out, but according to his surviving ledger notes, Carver had already shored up the ground with fresh timber and earth. Royce recorded simply, "No evidence of crime. Pigs in common health. Proprietor calm." It was filed and forgotten. Still the whispers grew. Farmers along the road began sending their children on longer routes to avoid the homestead. A passing surveyor, Josiah Crow, wrote in his notebook, "The dwelling is stone, in good repair, yet it feels abandoned even when inhabited. The silence is oppressive. The hogs move as though anticipating more than feed." It was also in this year that a faded handbill appeared in Mesilla warning travelers, "Keep to the high road after sundown. Men vanish in the low fields." Though unsigned, locals attributed it to Drum, still bitter over the loss of his hand. By midsummer, the matter reached the attention of a deputy from Donna Ana County, sent more for reassurance than justice. Deputy Allen Pike visited in July and conducted a brief search. In his affidavit, he claimed the house contained little furniture, no family photographs, and no women's or children's belongings. "A man's dwelling, wholly bare," he wrote. In the cellar, he found barrels of lard and salted pork, neatly stacked. He noted the smell was sharp, though not unnatural for hog keep. Yet Pike did record one audit. Is a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a loose stone near the hearth. Within were lists of dates and initials, TB, JK, SW, followed by tallies of weight and numbers. Whether these referred to livestock transactions or something darker was never established. Pike claimed he returned the book to its place, fearing he lacked authority to seize it. The ledger has never surfaced again. It was around this time that the wider atmosphere of the territory darkened. As the Lincoln County War neared, settlers grew suspicious of all strangers. Newspapers in Santa Fe and Las Cruces carried stories of gunfights, feuds, and cattle rustling. Against such bloodshed, the murmur of a lone farmer with odd habits was easily lost. Yet the few who lived nearest swore something was amiss. One letter from schoolteacher Crane, dated September 1873, carried a grim line. "I heard again the terrible squealing by night, like souls in torment. The man is not natural. I fear what he casts into that pit." Her words, though never published at the time, remain one of the clearest voices testifying to the unease that surrounded the homestead. The escalation came in the winter of 1873, when a stagecoach bound from El Paso to Santa Fe vanished with all 4 passengers between stops. The wrecked carriage was later discovered near a gulch, the team of horses gone and the driver missing. It was an incident too large to be ignored. For the first time, territorial newspapers carried front-page concern about growing lawlessness upon the southern roads. Though robbery was assumed, speculation soon drifted toward Carver's stretch of land. A peddler arriving late in Mesilla claimed he had seen a wagon wheel half buried in the mud near the homestead's fence line. Another swore he glimpsed a bonnet tangled in brush by the pig pen. No evidence was secured, but the stories hardened suspicion. Marshal Lowe was compelled to return, this time with 2 deputies. His journal, fragmentary but consistent, recorded the visit. Arrived to Carver's place at sundown. Man calm, though reserved. Hog pen stirred, animals restless. Conducted search of barn, house, and yard. Found no trace of missing coach, passengers, or driver. Only abundance of salted meats. Carver produced receipt for hog sale in Las Cruces. no grounds for arrest. Still, Lowe admitted in a marginal note that the pigs appeared distended, glutted. He noted unusual mounds of fresh earth at the far corner of the pen, but dusk and poor authority kept him from further digging. Locals began to murmur that the marshal was either blind or complicit. Families along the road armed themselves, and drifters gave the house a wide berth. But not all could avoid it. The homestead sat on a vital junction, and water was scarce in the scrub. Travelers still stopped, sometimes for necessity, sometimes unknowingly. One of the few who escaped described the encounter years later to a reporter. A miner named Silas Kerr recalled being invited into the kitchen for a meal. The men set bread before me, but no word. The hogs squealed without pause, as though knowing. I looked at his eyes and thought them cold, like the stone of his house. I ate not, and when he turned, I fled. By now, Carver had become a figure of whispered dread. To some, he was a killer in plain sight, hiding bodies beneath his pigs. To others, he was an unlucky recluse, the target of baseless fear. But the evidence, loose though it was, kept piling. Disappearances continued, rumors thickened, and the ledger noted earlier by Deputy Pike lingered in memory, an unclaimed key to the truth. Meanwhile, newspapers increasingly focused on the rising hostilities in Lincoln County. The looming war of ranchers and merchants cast shadows far wider than a single homestead. In that turbulence, one man's crimes could easily slip between the cracks. Yet those living nearest could not forget the cries in the night, the restless pigs, and the silence of the stone house. The discovery came not from lawmen, but from children. In early 1874, 2 boys from a nearby family strayed while hunting rabbits. They wandered close to the Carver homestead, following the sound of hogs. Later, in frightened whispers to their mother, they described finding scraps of cloth in the mud near the pen, a sleeve torn and bloody, as one put it. Their mother, horrified, carried the fabric to Reverend Gill, who in turn reported it to Justice Royce. For the first time, an item that might connect Carver to the vanishings was in official hands. Royce summoned Carver, who appeared calm and dismissive. He claimed the cloth was old rag for feed, tossed to the pigs along with kitchen scraps. Royce, lacking power and wary of pressing too hard, released him. But the rumor spread quickly, a child's discovery. Pigs fed not only slop, but clothing. Neighbors began recalling their own observations. Ezra Long swore he once saw Carver hauling a wheelbarrow at midnight, dumping its load into the pen. Miss Crane repeated her claims of tormented squeals on moonless nights, and a teamster named George Wilkes reported finding hoofprints that led to Carver's fence and ended there. In the wider county, patience wore thin. Marshal Lowe, embarrassed by earlier inaction, requested additional men from Santa Fe. His petition was denied. Resources were already strained as factions in Lincoln County inched closer to war. The government's eyes were on cattle barons and armed bands, not a solitary farmer. Yet the pressure of community fear forced Lowe to act again. He returned with a single deputy in April 1874 and demanded access to the pens. According to his own later account, Carver complied without protest. The hogs, huge and restless, were driven aside as Lowe and his deputy dug at the fresh earth. What they found was described only in vague terms in Lowe's journal: unearth, head remains of unwholesome nature, fragments of bone not consistent with swine. Disturbed earth extended deeper than our spades could reach. Due to failing light and hostility of animals, suspended search. Proprietor maintained silence. The journal ends there for that date. No bones were preserved, no charges filed. Some later suggested Carver bribed the marshal, others that Lowe feared reprisal in a lawless county. Whatever the reason, the investigation halted, and the evidence was lost to the hogs and soil. From that point, the legend hardened into near certainty. Around campfires, travelers spoke not of rumor, but of the man who feeds men to pigs. Folklore overtook fact, yet it clung to the one truth all agreed upon. Those who vanished were often last seen near the stone house. Still, Carver remained free, walking the town market on occasion, buying tools, nodding curtly at neighbors. His calm presence, unbroken by accusation, unsettled them more than any confession might have done. By the summer of 1874, fear had curdled into hostility. Families who once only whispered began speaking more openly. At the trading post in Mesilla, Isaac Drum reportedly slammed his fist upon the counter and declared, "That man's hogs have eaten more Christian souls than wolves and cholera combined." The words traveled quickly. Carver, for his part, remained outwardly unshaken. He appeared in town once a month, always alone, purchasing salt, tools, and occasionally seed. Witnesses recalled his exchanges as curt, businesslike, without hint of shame. Some described his expression as blank, others as quietly amused by the growing storm around him. A few dared to confront him indirectly. Reverend Gill, in a sermon that July, spoke of Cain among us, feeding upon his brother's flesh. Carver was said to have stood outside the church door as parishioners exited, arms folded, expressionless. No words passed, but the message was clear. He knew, and he was not moved. The breaking point came after the disappearance of a young mail rider named Joseph Yates. His horse was found tethered near the river, saddle intact, no rider in sight. Witnesses swore he had taken the road past Carver's land that morning. This time anger swept the settlement. Men gathered in Drum's barn, vowing to ride as a group to the stone house. Yet cooler voices intervened. Justice Royce argued that vigilante action would invite bloodshed and lawlessness. He pleaded for patience, promising to petition again for territorial support. His plea carried the day, but just barely. Tension remained like a storm cloud above the valley. That August, another curious report surfaced. A traveling tinker, lodging one night at a neighbor's cabin, claimed he heard strange sounds near Carver's land. Not hogs, he insisted, but voices, low and broken, as though calling for help. The account was dismissed by some as ghost, whiskey talk, yet it added fuel to the fire. Even among those who doubted the tales, a sense of unease grew. A merchant later recalled, "Whether guilty or not, he carried the weight of death about him. Folks crossed the street rather than meet his eyes." It was around this time that the Lincoln County troubles burst into armed conflict. Gunfire between factions consumed headlines and pulled men into militias. Once again, Carver's case was eclipsed. Amid battles and killings, the fate of a few missing drifters seemed small. Yet to those living in the shadow of his homestead, the dread was constant. Some stories from this period blur into folklore. Tales of travelers glimpsing pale shapes near the hog pen, or of Carver speaking in strange tones to his animals. None can be proven, but all contributed to the legend. What can be said with certainty is this. By the end of 1874, the homesteader stood isolated, feared by all, confronted by none. His pigs grew fatter, his farm stood silent, and the road beside it grew darker with every retelling of vanished souls. The decision to act came in early 1875, when pressure from settlers reached its peak. At a meeting held in the back room of Messilla's tavern, Drum, Long, and several others argued that waiting for the marshal had proven useless. "If the law won't dig, we will," Drum declared, according to later recollections. A party of 6 men rode out before dawn, carrying shovels and rifles. Their plan was simple: confront Carver, search the pens, and put an end to the rumors. But when they arrived, the homestead stood oddly still. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, yet no man came forth. The pigs stirred, restless and loud, as though anticipating what would follow. The search began without ceremony. The men pried open the gates of the sty, driving the hogs aside, and set to work digging in the far corner where the earth appeared freshly turned. After an hour, they uncovered what one described later as splintered bone, not beastly in nature. Others recalled cloth fragments, buttons, and a boot heel, gnawed but intact. Fear overtook resolve. Some swore the bones were human. Others, uncertain, insisted they belonged to oxen or deer. The group argued, the evidence too fragmentary to end debate. In the midst of their quarrel, Carver himself appeared at the doorway of his house. Witnesses described him standing calmly, arms at his sides, expression blank. He said nothing, but the men, unnerved, ceased their digging. One later claimed Carver's dog growled low, pacing before the door, while the pigs screamed behind the men, as if enraged by the disturbance. Drum urged they seize him, but others faltered. Without clear proof, they feared being branded murderers themselves. At last they mounted their horses and withdrew, carrying only the memory of what they had seen. In town, their testimony split, some convinced they had unearthed victims, others unwilling to stake their lives on an uncertain bones. Carver returned to his routine, unfazed. Days later, he was seen in the market, purchasing feed and lard tins as if nothing had happened. The settlers, shaken by their own failure, grew more divided than before. Some wanted another attempt. Others insisted they leave him be. It was in this climate of doubt that a letter surfaced in the Santa Fe Gazette, penned by an anonymous traveler. It spoke of a farm where hogs eat what the desert cannot bury, tended by a man of stone. Whether truth or embellishment, the piece spread the tale beyond the territory. Soon, Carver was no longer just a local specter, but a figure whispered about across the West. And yet, for all the fear and accusation, he remained untouched. The law had failed, the settlers had faltered, and the man with the pigs continued his silent vigil beside the road. The stir created by the Gazette article reached Santa Fe, and with it came pressure on territorial authorities to intervene. By mid-1875, a formal order was issued for Marshal Lowe to assemble a posse and bring Carver in for questioning. The order itself survives in courthouse archives, signed by Judge Nathaniel Brent. Lowe, weary from years of criticism, gathered 4 deputies and rode south. Their plan was to surprise Carver at dawn, seize his property, and search for evidence under lawful authority. The party arrived in early September, only to find the house abandoned. The door stood ajar, the hearth cold, the hogs restless and hungry. Inside, they discovered what the earlier settlers had missed: a hidden room beneath the cellar floor. A loose plank concealed a narrow stair, leading into a cramped space with stone walls. Here, they found a scattering of personal effects: boots, belts, a child's hair ribbon, and a cracked fiddle missing its strings. Among them was a blood-stained ledger, similar to the one Deputy Pike had noted years earlier. The entries were longer now, filled with initials and dates stretching back 5 years. At the bottom of one page was a chilling note: "Fed and gone." The discovery shook the posse, yet their quarry was gone. Outside, fresh hoofprints led away from the homestead, suggesting Carver had left days earlier with his horse and dog. Where he fled was unclear. Some believed he rode west toward Arizona territory, others that he vanished south into Chihuahua, Mexico. The posse returned to Mesilla with the items, presenting them as evidence. Yet in court, difficulties arose. The bones unearthed earlier had not been preserved. The ledger contained no full names, and the personal effects, though suspicious, could not be tied to specific missing persons. Judge Brent, citing lack of proof, refused to issue a conviction in absentia, the FESU. Allure enraged the settlers. Once again, Carver had slipped through the cracks. His farm, stripped of animals and left to ruin, quickly became a place of avoidance. Children swore they heard squeals in the empty pens long after the hogs were gone. Hunters claimed the house creaked at night, though no wind stirred. In the wider territory, focus shifted back to the Lincoln County War, which erupted into open battle by 1877. Newspapers carried stories of shootouts, mercenaries, and the rise of figures like Billy the Kid. Carver's tale receded to the margins, a rumor overshadowed by larger violence. But among those who had dug in the soil, who had seen the ledger and the hidden room, the memory did not fade. They spoke in low tones of a man who turned his hogs into accomplices, and of a case that the law could never pin down. After the homestead was abandoned, stories of Carver shifted into pursuit. In early 1876, a trader traveling through Arizona territory reported meeting a quiet ranch hand who called himself Elias Carter. The man matched Carver's description: broad-shouldered, weathered face, and a dog that never left his side. The trader recalled the unsettling familiarity, only after reading of Carver in a newspaper weeks later. Another account came from Texas that same year. A sheriff in El Paso claimed a drifter had been jailed for drunkenness, giving the name Edward Carr. He was released after a night in the cell, but the sheriff noted his odd silence and the dog pacing outside the jailhouse door. Whether this was Carver remains uncertain, but the pattern of aliases and sudden disappearances deepened the mystery. In 1877, during the height of the Lincoln County War, rumors placed him in Chihuahua, working as a stableman. The source was a mercenary who swore he recognized the man's hollow eyes and iron stillness. Yet the claim could not be verified. In the chaos of border towns, men came and went without trace. Meanwhile, back in New Mexico, the abandoned homestead decayed. Travelers noted broken fences, weeds overtaking the sty, and the house windows shattered by storms. Yet the place carried a reputation so grim that no settler would claim it. One surveyor wrote in his notebook, "Ground soft, air foul, no bird nests here." Locals avoided the property, steering children away with whispered warnings. The ledger, however, remained in official custody. Though dismissed as circumstantial in court, it was studied by a few curious scholars decades later. Its crude entries, initials paired with weights, were interpreted by some as hog tallies, by others as a grim roll of victims. A professor from the University of New Mexico, reviewing it in the 1920s, remarked, "Whether true or imagined, this document records something more than livestock. It is the hand of a mind both methodical and cold." In folklore, Carver became less man and more specter. Campfire tales turned him into a ghostly figure who walked with hogs at his side, forever hungry. Yet behind the exaggerations lay the stubborn fact: real people had vanished, and their fates were never resolved. The Lincoln County War burned itself out by 1879, leaving the territory scarred and lawless. In its wake, Carver's legend was overshadowed but not erased. Occasional reports of a solitary man with a dog surfaced in Colorado, Kansas, even as far as Missouri. None confirmed, all adding to the haze of uncertainty. By the close of the decade, the man had disappeared from record entirely. Whether he died in obscurity, crossed into Mexico under a new name, or continued his wanderings is unknown. What remained was the ruin of a farm, a ledger of initials, and the fear that justice had slipped away, leaving only rumor and unease. By the turn of the century, Carver's name had slipped into folklore, but the ruins of his homestead still stood, battered by wind and neglect. Farmers in the region avoided the place, claiming the soil was soured and no crops would grow there. Children dared one another to run past the pig pen, still marked by collapsed timbers and churned earth. In 1902, a local historian named Dr. Milton Avery began gathering accounts of the vanished settlers of the 1870s. Avery, a physician by trade, was fascinated by cases where rumor clashed with record. In his notes, later published in a small regional journal, he described the Carver case as a study in terror without closure. He interviewed descendants of families who had lived nearby, including the aging Reverend Jill, who by then was nearly blind. Jill, recalling his encounters, told Avery, "He bore the look of one who had no place among men. I preached of Cain, and Cain stood outside my door." Avery pressed him about the pigs, but the Reverend only shook his head. "The cries were not for swill," he said softly. Avery also examined courthouse archives, unearthing Lowe's journal fragments and the ledger. He was among the first to point out the parallels between Carver's disappearances and the broader lawlessness of the Lincoln County War years. He argued that the absence of resolution in Carver's case was partly due to the overwhelming violence of the time, when lawmen were consumed with factional battles and cattle disputes. Locals, however, told Avery more haunting tales. One woman, the daughter of Ezra Long, claimed her father never forgave himself for not pressing harder after seeing the stained soil in 1873. He swore the earth stank of iron, she said, and that no rain could wash it away. Another account came from a rancher who swore that in the 1880s he passed by the ruin and saw fresh hoofprints leading to two. He sty, though the house had been abandoned for years. Avery collected these fragments carefully, publishing them in a small volume titled Unresolved Shadows of the Territory. The work circulated little, but among those who read it, the Carver story regained its power. Some treated it as cautionary folklore, others as proof of the limits of frontier justice. The site itself grew only more unsettling with age. In the 1910s, a fire swept through the brushlands and consumed what remained of the roof. The stone walls still stood blackened, and the cellar mouth yawned open like a wound. Ranchers passing by claimed their horses shied from the place, refusing to drink from the nearby trough. By the 1920s, university students conducting surveys of early settlements visited the ruins. One wrote in his diary, "We found buttons, nails, and fragments of bone too small to identify. The earth remains dark, even after 50 years. A feeling of dread pervades the site, inexplicable in daylight." What began as a series of disappearances had by then transformed into a legend, half history, half ghost story, yet always rooted in the physical ground of New Mexico territory. By the mid-20th century, the Carver story had become more folklore than fact. In ranch kitchens and roadside camps, the tale was told with variations. Sometimes Carver was described as a butcher, other times a failed preacher, always a man who turned to feeding his hogs what others would bury. The essentials remained. Travelers vanished, the pigs grew fat, and no justice was ever done. Oral historians collecting stories from elderly settlers in the 1930s noted that the Carver legend carried a peculiar consistency. Nearly all versions mentioned the pigs, the silence of the stone house, and the unsettling calm of the man himself. Yet details blurred with time. Some placed him near Lincoln rather than Messiah. Others claimed he operated during the war years directly, mingling his crimes with the chaos of Billy the Kid and his cohorts. What remained constant was the dread. A WPA folklorist recorded an elderly woman's words in 1938. Children were told not to wander at night, lest the hogs of Carver find them. We never went near that land after dark. Even the dogs would not bark in its direction. Stories also began drifting into the supernatural. Some swore that on still nights, squeals could be heard from the ruin long after the hogs were gone. Others claimed ghostly lights flickered in the cellar, or that Carver himself had been seen standing among the mesquite, unchanged by time. Folklorists noted these additions, but separated them from the older, more grounded testimonies of missing men and found objects. One curious connection emerged when Avery's earlier work was revisited in the 1940s. A historian noted that Carver's timeline aligned with the same years that violent conflict escalated in the Lincoln County War. The war drew away law enforcement, allowing Carver, if guilty, to operate in the shadows. The historian concluded, "The Carver story is not a tale apart from history, but one hidden within it. He was a parasite feeding beneath the carcass of greater violence." Local ranchers continued to avoid the site. Even as modern highways cut across the territory, the old track near the ruins remained a place of unease. A survey team in 1952 reported their horses balking at the approach, forcing them to dismount and lead them past. One surveyor wrote in his field notes, "I laughed at the old stories, but standing among the stones, I confess the air is wrong. Silence presses too close." Thus the tale endured. No graves confirmed, no conviction ever reached. Yet the Carver homestead lived on as one of the most unsettling case files of the frontier. The records were fragmented, but the whispers were not. Had passed through several hands, but was never truly settled. Ranchers who purchased the acreage often abandoned it within a few years, citing poor soil, unreliable water, or the remoteness of the tract. Yet in private letters, a different reason was given, an unease that lingered on the property. One rancher's son, interviewed in 1967, recalled, "Pa said the cattle wouldn't feed near the old sty. They'd circle wide around it, like something was buried there they could smell, but we could not." During this period, hikers and amateur historians began seeking out the ruins. Articles in regional papers referenced The Cannibal of Messia, though none could prove that Carver had practiced cannibalism himself. The title was a reflection of the enduring fascination with the case and its blending into folklore. Visitors described the cellar as half-collapsed, filled with debris, yet still carrying a damp, sour odor. A few researchers brought back fragments, buttons, shards of ceramic, even a rusted spur. None conclusively linked to victims, but all suggestive of lives interrupted. In 1974, a student from the University of New Mexico wrote in his thesis, "The Carver homestead demonstrates how folklore can preserve suspicion long after evidence is gone. Yet even the soil seems complicit, dark, heavy, and difficult to till, as though holding its secrets." Local law enforcement occasionally received reports of trespassers at the site. Teenagers dared one another to spend the night in the ruins, and a few returned shaken. One group in 1979 swore they heard squeals from the empty pen and found fresh hoof marks in the dust by morning. Deputies dismissed it as prank or imagination, but the stories circulated widely. The Lincoln County War by this time had become a subject of scholarly interest and even popular films. Agatha's. Against that backdrop, the Carver case was occasionally mentioned as a grim footnote, a reminder that violence on the frontier did not always carry guns and gangs, but sometimes hid in silence, in the hands of a solitary man and his animals. By the 1980s, folklore collectors noted that the Carver story had become a cautionary tale. Parents told children not to stray, warning that Carver's hogs still roam at night. Though few believed it literally, the legend persisted, anchored in the ruins that refused to fade entirely into the desert. The whispers that began in 1872 had survived a century. They were no longer about guilt or innocence, but about presence, an unease tied to a particular place where the line between history and myth blurred beyond recognition. In the 1990s, renewed interest in frontier crimes led a small team of archaeologists to the Carver site. Sponsored by a regional historical society, the project aimed to separate fact from folklore. For 2 weeks in the summer of 1993, trenches were dug across the area where the pig pens once stood. What they found was unsettling, though not conclusive. Dozens of bone fragments were unearthed, many clearly animal, hog, cattle, and deer. But among them were several pieces that specialists could not immediately identify. 2 fragments in particular, a section of jaw and a portion of femur, bore characteristics more consistent with human remains than livestock. Tests were inconclusive, due partly to erosion and contamination, but the possibility was enough to reignite the legend. The excavation also revealed layers of discarded items, rusted cutlery, buttons, fragments of leather boots, and a child's toy whistle made of tin. The archaeologists catalogued everything carefully, yet even they admitted that context was difficult. Were these merely the debris of travelers who stopped at the homestead, or evidence of something darker? The findings were quietly published in an academic journal, but local newspapers seized on the human bone fragments. Headlines declared, "Bones found at Carver Farm, legend true." The coverage renewed fascination with the case, and the old story was once again retold in taverns and classrooms. Older residents, however, were less surprised. One rancher, interviewed after the dig, remarked, "We always knew the earth out there held secrets. Didn't need professors to tell us." The archaeologists returned in 1995 for a second, smaller survey, this time focusing on the cellar. They found evidence of fire, charred beams and scorched stone, consistent with the brush fire of the 1910s, but also curious scorch marks within the cellar itself, as though an attempt had been made to destroy records or possessions. No further bones were recovered, but the atmosphere of the ruin was described in their notes as oppressive. Around this time, paranormal investigators began visiting the site, though their accounts leaned towards spectacle rather than scholarship. Reports of phantom squeals, shadows among the stones, and cold drafts in midsummer filled tabloids and local radio. Folklorists cautioned against conflating legend with fact, yet the attention ensured that Carver's story remained alive well into the new century. Through it all, the academic debate persisted. Was Carver a murderer hiding in plain sight, or a victim of coincidence, his solitary life mistaken for guilt in a time of unrest. The ledger, the bones, and the vanishings offered no final answer, only a puzzle locked in the soil of New Mexico territory. By the early 2000s, the Carver site had become an unofficial destination for hikers, amateur historians, and thrill-seekers. The ruins, located off a little-used trail, were marked only by low stone walls and the collapsed mouth of the cellar. Yet those who visited often came away with stories of unease. In 2003, a group of university students filming a documentary on frontier myths recorded interviews with locals in Mesilla. One elderly rancher told them, "That land doesn't want company. Horses won't graze there. Dogs won't cross the fence. It's as if the ground remembers what was done." When the students visited the ruins, they reported a curious stillness. Audio recordings captured what some described as faint squealing, though skeptics attributed it to wind through the broken timbers. The footage was never widely released, but fragments appeared years later in an online archive, adding to the aura of the story. Meanwhile, hikers continued to share accounts of strange experiences. Some described finding fresh hoofprints in the dust, despite no nearby livestock. Others claimed to hear low growls near the cellar, only to find nothing when they turned. A local guide remarked, "People laugh at the legend, but when they stand there, the laughter stops." Documentarians revisiting the case in 2010 compared Carver's story to other frontier mysteries. They noted how the Lincoln County War consumed the attention of lawmen and newspapers, creating shadows where crimes like his could flourish unseen. They argued that Carver was less a monster of folklore and more a symptom of a lawless time, an era where violence was common but not always acknowledged. The ledger, preserved in archives, was digitized around this period, allowing new eyes to study its cryptic entries. Historians pointed out the eerie regularity of dates and initials, each paired with weights that matched no known system of livestock accounting. Some suggested it was a personal code, others that it truly was a tally of lives taken. But no final consensus emerged. By the 2010s, the Carver site was mentioned in ghost hunting shows and podcasts, further blurring fact and fiction. While skeptics dismissed these accounts as theatrics, the persistence of the legend itself became part of the fascination. Why, after more than a century, did this obscure case still unsettle those who heard it? Perhaps because the records never closed, and the soil itself seemed to hold back answers. Carver had vanished into history, but the land remained, whispering in silence. In the last 2 decades, the Carver story has shifted from local legend to a subject of quiet academic curiosity. A handful of graduate theses and regional history books now treat it as a case study in how folklore and incomplete records intertwine. Some authors emphasize the absence of proof, arguing that without preserved bodies, Carver cannot be named a murderer with certainty. Others highlight the repeated testimonies, the ledger, and the found objects as pointing to a pattern too grim to ignore. Locals, however, often take a simpler view. To them, the story was never about courts or consensus. It was about memory. An aging ranch hand told a reporter in 2016, "Whether he did it or not, people vanished on that road, and folks remembered. That's enough." Interestingly, scholars studying the Lincoln County War occasionally mention Carver in passing. They note how lawlessness in those years created conditions where private crimes could fester unnoticed. The war's violence became the official history. Carver's alleged acts remained in the margins. Yet both, they argue, were expressions of the same frontier instability. Meanwhile, the land itself has not shaken its reputation. A hiker in 2018 described feeling a weight, like walking into a closed room after something terrible has happened. Another visitor photographed the ruins at dusk and later swore that faint shapes appeared in the shadows, though most dismissed this as a trick of light. The county eventually posted small warning signs discouraging trespass, citing safety concerns with the unstable cellar, but the signs themselves only deepened the site's allure. To this day, visitors slip past, leaving offerings of coins, bottles, or crude wooden crosses along the collapsed pig pen. Some say these are gestures of respect for the lost. Others see them as talismans against whatever unease still clings to the place. In interviews, folklorists stress the importance of separating rumor from fact, yet they also acknowledge that folklore, in its way, preserves truths that official record does not. Something happened at Carver's homestead, whether murder, disappearance, or merely the growth of fear around a strange man and his pigs. That uncertainty is precisely why the tale endures. Today, the Carver homestead exists more in memory than in stone. The walls have collapsed further, the cellar filled with debris, and weeds choke the fence lines. Yet even in ruin, the site retains its reputation. Locals guide visitors past with a wary wave, rarely stopping. When asked why, one resident said simply, "It's not a place to linger." Historical tours of the Lincoln County War occasionally mention Carver as a footnote, a reminder of the private horrors that could exist alongside public battles. Guides note how figures like Billy the Kid became infamous in newspapers, while Carver, if guilty, was remembered only in whispers. This contrast unsettles listeners, suggesting that the most haunting crimes are sometimes those that never reach trial. The ledger, now preserved in a climate-controlled archive, is occasionally displayed during exhibits on frontier law. Its cryptic initials and tallies draw quiet stares. Visitors wonder aloud if they are looking at a mundane hog ledger or the cold record of human lives. The absence of an answer is part of its power. Folklore still thrives. In recent years, hikers have posted online about unease at the site, odd sounds, the sense of being watched, or finding hoof-shaped impressions in hard soil, where no livestock roam. Most laugh it off afterward, but the pattern is steady enough to echo the old stories. In 2020, a small group of independent researchers returned with ground-penetrating radar. They detected anomalies beneath the soil near the pen, disturbed earth consistent with multiple burials. Permission to excavate was denied by county officials, citing preservation rules. Thus, the possibility of confirmation remains buried, literally, beneath the earth. And so the Carver case persists in its strange balance. Too much smoke to dismiss, too little fire to convict. For some, he is a figure of terror who outwitted Jew Stice. For others, a lonely man scapegoated by fearful neighbors. The truth may never be known, but the land still carries the weight of the question. Standing at the site today, little remains but a scatter of stones and the faint outline of the pig pens. The desert wind moves through the brush, carrying the same silence that once surrounded the homestead. Visitors speak of the weight that hangs in the air, as though the ground itself resists forgetting. What makes the Carver story so enduring is not proof, but the absence of it. In the official ledgers of the county, he appears only briefly. A land purchase, a few scraps of testimony, the journal of a marshal too cautious to dig deeper. In folklore, however, he looms large, the quiet man whose hogs grew fat while travelers vanished. The facts and the whispers cannot be fully separated, and perhaps that is why the case lingers so uneasily. Historians often return to the Lincoln County War as the defining violence of New Mexico in the 1870s. Yet here, in the shadow of those battles, was another kind of war, private, hidden, and unresolved. Whether Carver was truly guilty may never be proven, but the people who vanished on that road remain unaccounted for, and their memory gives weight to every rumor. Even now, hikers and ranchers speak of strange unease at the ruins. A few claim to hear faint squeals on the wind or to glimpse movement among the stones at dusk. Most dismiss it as imagination, but the stories echo the same warnings passed down for more than a century. The land remembers. The case ends where it began, in uncertainty. The homesteader vanished, the hogs long gone, yet the soil still holds its silence. Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath that churned earth, waiting for a spade that may never come. Or perhaps it has already slipped beyond reach, leaving only whispers in the desert night. This is the legacy of the Carver homestead in New Mexico Territory. Not resolution, but an echo that will not fade.